My uncle looked me dead in the eye in front of the entire boardroom table and said, "Who approved her being here? Not my name, not my title, just her." Like I was a stray that had wandered in off King Street. I had driven 4 hours from Sudbury to Toronto in a February snowstorm for that meeting. My wipers were half frozen the whole way down the 400. I'd rehearsed my presentation in my head for most of the drive, running through the numbers, anticipating questions, reminding myself to slow down when I got nervous. And the moment I walked through the door of Hartwell Structural's 32nd floor boardroom, my uncle, the man whose firm bore our family name, turned to the room and performed his disgust like it was the best act he'd ever put on. The engineers at that table didn't laugh. They were too professional for that. But I watched them look at their laptops, their coffee cups, anywhere but at me. That particular silence is its own kind of humiliation, the kind that sits in your chest for days. I'm 31 years old. My name is Claire Hartwell, and I'm a structural engineer, or I was supposed to be one, according to every degree, every license, every project I'd completed for the past 8 years, until my uncle decided that his son's career mattered more than the truth of what I'd built. That day in the boardroom wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment I finally understood there was no version of this story where I won by playing nice. Let me take you back to where it actually started. I grew up in Sudbury, which people from Toronto love to make jokes about. The rock, the old smelters, the winters that feel like they're personal. My father passed when I was 11, a workplace accident at a mine site north of the city. My mother raised me and my younger brother on a nurse's salary and an absolute refusal to feel sorry for herself. She was the most competent person I have ever known, and she was invisible to half the world because of it. I think about that a lot. My uncle, my father's older brother, had built Hartwell Structural from a two-person drafting office in the 90s into one of the mid-sized firms doing real work on infrastructure projects across Ontario. Bridges, overpasses, public transit structures. When I was in high school and told him I wanted to study civil engineering at Laurentian, he took me out for dinner at the Laughing Buddha and said, "The family needs someone like you. You've got your dad's brain." I was 17 and I believed him completely. I should say here, because it matters, that my cousin Derek was already at the firm by the time I graduated. Derek is 4 years older than me. He has a business degree from Western, a firm handshake, and an extraordinary ability to take credit for things he didn't do. My uncle worshipped him, always had. Derek was the heir apparent, the name on the wall waiting to happen. My uncle treated him like a gold statue he'd commissioned and was very proud of. I joined Hartwell Structural 6 years ago as a junior engineer. I told myself the family connection was a foundation, not a ceiling. I worked harder than anyone in that office. I was in by 7 most mornings and I took every unglamorous project, load analyses on aging pedestrian bridges, inspection reports on culvert systems, the kind of infrastructure work that doesn't get you on a magazine cover but keeps people safe. I learned the firm from the ground up. 2 years in, I was assigned as lead engineer on a pedestrian overpass project in Sault Ste. Marie, a federally funded replacement for a 60-year-old structure over a rail corridor. It was the largest single project I'd handled solo. I spent 7 months on that design, custom approach, material specifications tuned to northern freeze-thaw cycles, a drainage system I was genuinely proud of. When the city engineer reviewed our submission, she sent back a note saying it was one of the cleanest structural packages her office had seen in years. That note should have had my name on it, prominently in the record. Instead, at the firm's annual client reception at the Albany Club in Toronto, I stood beside the project display board and listened to my uncle introduce Derek as the mind behind our Sault Ste. Marie overpass. Derek had attended one site visit. He'd CC'd himself on 3 emails. He stood there in his suit, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, and he never once looked at me. I told myself it was politics. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be ways of not dealing with what was actually happening. The person who made me stop telling myself those things was a woman named Patricia Ngozi. She was a project manager at the Federal Infrastructure Office in Ottawa, and she had a habit of asking exactly the right question at the wrong time for people who were lying. She had been part of the oversight committee for the Sault Ste. Marie project, and she tracked down my direct line through the firm directory about a month after that reception. "I'm pulling together a case study on Northern Climate Bridge design for the ministry," she said. "I want to talk to the engineer who did the drainage specifications on the Seoul project. The submission has your name as lead on the technical package. Is that right?" I said yes. My voice was very steady. I remember being surprised at how steady it was. We talked for 45 minutes. By the end of it, she asked if I'd be willing to consult on a new federal overpass tender in Northern Ontario, a more complex project, longer timeline, higher budget. She said she'd seen a lot of submissions from firms across the province, and mine had a quality of thinking she didn't come across often. I said I'd need to bring it to my uncle for approval, since it would run through the firm. She said, "Of course, have him call me." He didn't call her. For 3 weeks, every time I asked about it, he said he was looking into capacity. Then one morning I walked past the glass-walled conference room and saw Derek in there with a man I didn't recognize, a federal procurement badge on his lanyard, and a printed copy of my drainage methodology on the table. My methodology, the one I'd written, the page numbers and the headers had been changed. Derek's name was on the cover. I stood in the hallway for what felt like a very long time. I did not go in. I went back to my desk. I opened my project folder on the server and I made a copy of everything: original files, version histories, submission timestamps, email threads. I copied it all to an encrypted personal drive and I took it home that night in my coat pocket. I didn't sleep well after that. I lay awake in my apartment on Elm Street, listening to the city outside and trying to work out what I was dealing with. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a grey area. My uncle had taken something I built and handed it to his son because that was the plan all along. I was the labour. Derek was the legacy. I had been useful, not valued. I thought about calling my mother, but I knew what she'd say. She'd tell me to document everything and be careful. She'd been watching men manage upward on women's work her entire career. She'd tell me the system was designed to make this hard. She'd be right, and I wasn't ready to hear it yet. Instead, I went for a drive. I ended up parked at Sunwapta Point Lookout on the edge of the city at 2 in the morning, engine running for the heat, looking out at the lights on the hill. I thought about my father. I thought about the fact that he never got to see me graduate, never got to see any of this. And I thought about what Patricia Ngozi had said on the phone, the quality of thinking. That was mine. That could not be transferred on a cover page. I decided that night that I was not going to disappear quietly. The meeting I mentioned at the top. The Boardroom, February. My uncle's performance, that came 3 weeks after I'd sent an email to Patricia Ngozi directly, with copies of the original technical files, clearly dated, with version histories attached, and a brief professional note explaining the discrepancy she might find between the submission she'd received and the underlying work. I didn't accuse anyone. I just sent the truth, documented. My uncle found out about the email 2 days before the meeting. I don't know who told him, the federal contact, a colleague, Derek himself. By the time I walked into that boardroom, he'd had 48 hours to build his version of events. He opened with, "Who approved her being here?" and went from there. I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. I looked at him and I did not say anything yet, because I had learned from my mother that silence is often the most powerful sentence in the room. He talked for several minutes. He talked about how I'd gone behind the firm's back to a government client. He talked about family loyalty and professional conduct and undermining the business. He used the word rogue twice. He did not once say my name. He referred to me as this situation. At some point during his speech, the door opened and Patricia Ngozi walked in. She had flown in from Ottawa that morning. I hadn't known she was coming. She'd told no one except the firm's front desk, apparently. She sat down at the far end of the table with a leather portfolio in her hands and waited for my uncle to finish. He didn't know who she was at first. He assumed she was admin. The assumption was audible in the way he glanced at her and kept going. "I'm Patricia Ngozi," she said when he paused. "Deputy Director, Federal Infrastructure Investment, Ontario Region." She opened the portfolio. "I'm here because we have a significant contract under consideration with this firm, and I've been made aware of some concerns about attribution of technical work on prior submissions. I'd like those concerns resolved before we proceed." The room was very quiet. She laid a printed comparison on the table. Two documents side by side. The original submission with my name and timestamps. The resubmitted package Derek had put his name on. She didn't editorialize. She just put them there, the way you set down evidence in a room where everyone already knows what it means. My uncle started to speak. Patricia looked at him with an expression I will not forget as long as I live, not angry, not unkind, just absolutely immovable, and said, "I'd like to hear from the engineer of record first." Everyone looked at me. I had spent the drive down from Sudbury rehearsing for a hostile room. I had not prepared for this. For a moment my throat closed completely. Then I thought of something my mother used to say: "Just tell what you saw. Not what you felt, not what you want, just what you saw." So I did. I walked them through the project from beginning to end. The site parameters, the design decisions, the drainage methodology, the timeline. I answered every technical question anyone asked. I spoke for 20 minutes without notes. My hands were steady. When I finished, Patricia said, "Thank you." She looked at my uncle. "We'll be in touch about next steps on the contract." She was gone within 15 minutes of arriving. My uncle didn't speak to me for the rest of that meeting. The engineers at the table had the particular stillness of people who had just realized they'd been watching something much more important than they'd understood. What happened after that was not a single dramatic moment. It was a series of unglamorous institutional processes. Federal procurement flagged the submission discrepancy. An internal review was opened. My uncle hired an external lawyer within a week, which told me everything I needed to know about whether he thought he was on solid ground. Derek called me on a Wednesday evening. I was at home eating pasta, watching the news. He didn't open with an apology. He opened with, "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" Which, I have to say, was a remarkable choice of words. I let him finish. He was angry in the way people get angry when they've been comfortable for too long and the floor has suddenly moved. He talked about his career, his reputation, the deals that were now on hold, the relationships my uncle had spent decades building. He talked for a long time. He did not at any point acknowledge that he had put his name on something I made. "Derek," I said when he ran out of momentum, "you've been describing your situation for 10 minutes. You haven't once asked about mine." Silence. "Goodbye," I said. I blocked his number and finished my pasta. My uncle appeared at my apartment door on a Saturday morning in March, which I was not expecting. He was in civilian clothes, a parka, snow boots. Without the suit, he looked like what he actually was, a 63-year-old man who was scared. I stood in the doorway and did not invite him in. He told me he'd made some decisions he regretted. He told me the firm was under pressure and he'd prioritized badly. He used the phrase "big picture" 3 times, which meant he was trying to reframe a series of deliberate choices as an accumulation of stressful circumstances. He did not say the word sorry. He got close to it once, and then veered away, the way you brake before a stop sign and then roll through anyway. I said, "I know you're here because the review is going badly, not because you're sorry." He opened his mouth. He closed it. "I've been doing excellent work for this firm for 6 years," I said. "You used it to build your son's career and called me disloyal when I told the truth. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen so that the contract review goes more smoothly for you." He stood on my doorstep for another minute. Then he left. I watched him walk down the front steps to his car. I noticed his shoulders. He used to seem so large to me, that specific largeness of a person who has authority over you. Standing in my doorway watching him go, he just looked like a man in a parka walking to a sedan in the snow. I closed the door. The federal contract review concluded 4 months later. The ministry's decision was that the technical attribution discrepancy constituted a material misrepresentation in the submission process. Hartwell Structural was suspended from federal tendering for 18 months. Derek resigned from his director role. My uncle retained his position at the firm, but issued a formal correction to the project record naming me as the engineer of record on the Solstee Marie overpass, which, after years, finally went into the official file with my name on it. Patricia Ngozi contacted me in June with a separate offer. She was putting together a small technical advisory panel for a new federal program on resilient infrastructure in Northern Ontario, communities with aging structures, difficult freeze-thaw conditions, limited municipal engineering capacity. They needed someone who knew how to work in those conditions and had an interest in doing that work well. The contract was through the ministry directly, not through any firm. I accepted. I left Hartwell Structural that July. I cleaned out my desk on a Tuesday afternoon. I didn't make an announcement. I just packed my drafting pencils, my copy of the NBCC, a photo of my parents from my mother's nursing school graduation, one of the few photos I have of my father where he's laughing, and I carried everything out in a canvas bag. One of the junior engineers, a second year named Tomas, was in the hallway when I left. He'd started 8 months earlier. He was quiet, thorough, always the last to log off. He looked at my bag and then at me, and he said, "Are you coming back?" "No," I said. "Okay," he said, and then quietly, "I saw the original submission from the SALT project. I just want you to know that." I thanked him. It wasn't nothing. Those things are never nothing. I set up my own practice that fall. A small engineering consultancy, home office in Sudbury to start, registered with Professional Engineers Ontario, a second-hand plotter in the corner of the spare bedroom, and enough saved money to give myself 18 months of runway. I named it after the city where I grew up, which some people thought was sentimental. It wasn't. It was intentional. Nickel City Structural. I wanted to start somewhere honest. The first year was hard, in the way that hard years are, slow and administrative and full of proposals that didn't come back. I drove a lot of kilometers. I sat in a lot of municipal offices explaining who I was and what I could offer. Northern Ontario has infrastructure problems that the province has been slow to address, and municipalities that are doing the work with half the budget they need. There is no shortage of work. There is a shortage of engineers willing to take it seriously. My mother came to visit in January of the second year and sat at my kitchen table drinking tea while I went over a bridge inspection report for a small municipality east of Timmins. She watched me work for a while, and then she said, "You look like your dad when you're doing that." He used to get very still when he was thinking about something that mattered. I didn't say anything for a minute. "I wish he could see this," I said. "He'd be annoying about it," she said. "He'd want to understand all the math." I laughed. I hadn't laughed like that in a long time. The federal advisory panel work has expanded. Last spring, Patricia brought me in as the technical lead on a new national provincial cost-sharing program for rural bridge rehabilitation. Real budget, multi-year timeline, structures across 4 provinces. It is the largest project I have ever been on. My name is on every document. I have 3 associates at Nickel City Structural now. One is a young woman from Fort Frances who graduated last year from Lakehead. She reminds me a little of myself at 23, that particular combination of competence and uncertainty, always half wondering if she's allowed to be sure of herself yet. I try to be deliberate about making sure she knows the answer is yes. Last month, I was in Ottawa for a 2-day working session with the ministry panel. On the last evening, a few of us went for dinner at a place on Bank Street. Nothing special. Good food, long table, everybody exhausted in the good way from 2 days of actually useful work. Patricia sat across from me, and at some point near the end of the meal, she said, "I want to ask you something I probably should have asked years ago." I said, "Go ahead." "When I first called you about the SALT project, you could have referred me to your uncle. You could have let it go." "Yes," I said. "Why didn't you?" I thought about it. I thought about my father and my mother and driving home in the dark with a flash drive in my coat pocket. I thought about standing in that hallway watching my methodology on someone else's cover page. I thought about all the years of working hard in a building that had my name on the outside and still managed to make me invisible. Because it was true, I said. It was the true thing, and nobody was going to say it if I didn't. She nodded. She didn't make it into a big moment. I liked that about her. I drove back to Sudbury the next morning. It was early May and the Canadian Shield was doing that thing it does in the spring. The rock faces wet and dark against the sky, the birches just starting to green up along the highway. I had the radio on low and 4 hours of road in front of me and nothing I needed to prove to anyone. I thought about my uncle. I don't hate him. Hate takes a kind of ongoing investment I'm not interested in making. What I feel is something more like clarity, a clean understanding of who he turned out to be and what that cost both of us. His firm is still running. Derek is working somewhere in the private sector. Our family sees each other at Christmas with a careful politeness that nobody enjoys. That's what's left of it. What I built instead is this, a practice that's mine, a reputation built on work I actually did, a team of people I'm trying to treat honestly, and a name on bridge projects that will outlast all of us. Last week, I drove out to the Salt to look at a new project site, a rail underpass that needs assessment before winter. I parked on the shoulder and walked the embankment with my clipboard, taking notes on the drainage patterns and the frost heave evidence in the concrete apron. It was cold, grey, that specific northern October cold that settles into your hands. I could hear the freight traffic in the rail corridor below. I stood there for a while, just looking at the structure. It was unglamorous work. It was honest work. It was mine. The wind came off Lake Superior and I tilted my head into it, and I was not afraid of anything. I keep thinking about that moment in the boardroom, not the part where Patricia walked in, not the part where my uncle went quiet, but the part just before all of it, when I was sitting at that table with my hands folded and nobody in the room would look at me. That moment, because that's the one that tells you everything about how we got there and why it ended the way it did. What happened to me wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a misunderstanding that spiraled. My uncle made choices. Derek made choices, and they made them over and over across years because nothing in their environment required them to stop. That's how it works, I think. Not some cosmic accounting system tallying debts, just the plain, ordinary fact that dishonest systems eventually produce consequences, and the longer they run, the harder those consequences land. The Federal Review didn't come from nowhere. It came from a paper trail that was always there, from timestamps that couldn't be changed, from documentation I'd been keeping without fully knowing why. The truth had a longer memory than either of them counted on. But here's the thing I have to be honest about. None of that would have mattered if I hadn't been willing to say it out loud. I spent years being good at my work and assuming that would be enough. It wasn't. Competence without the willingness to defend it is just labor that's easy to take. What changed wasn't my skill. It was my decision to stop protecting people who weren't protecting me. That decision cost me sleep. It cost me a version of my family I'd been quietly hoping might still exist. It was the right call anyway. I think about Patricia a lot. The way she walked into that room and put 2 documents on a table without editorializing. That wasn't just professionalism. That was a kind of integrity I want to carry in my own practice. The ability to look at something clearly, name what you see, and let the evidence speak instead of performing around it. I'm still learning that. There are still moments when I soften things I shouldn't, when I hedge instead of stating. I notice it now, at least. I notice it and I try to do better. And then there's the endurance part, the part nobody really talks about because it isn't dramatic. It's the 18 months of slow work after everything fell apart, the proposals that came back as no, the drives up the 400 in January when the practice felt very small and very uncertain, the hours of honest, unglamorous work with no audience and no validation, just the problem in front of me and the question of whether I could solve it. That's where the actual thing was built. Not in the boardroom, not in the confrontation, in the ordinary persistence of showing up and doing it right when nobody was watching. Claire Hartwell, I now know, is not a name that belongs to anyone else. It took me longer than it should have to understand that. But I'm here now, in a practice I built from the ground up in a city I love, doing work that will be standing long after the politics of that boardroom have been completely forgotten. That feels like enough. More than enough, actually. It feels like the beginning of something I'm still figuring out how to describe. The wind came off Lake Superior, and I tilted my head into it, and I was not afraid of anything.